Hello and welcome to The Rundown, a weekly podcast from PoliticsHome. I'm your host, Alain Tolhurst, and given Parliament is in its Easter recess, we thought we'd eschew the politicians altogether and focus on some experts as we discuss whether we have a new energy bill crisis on our hands. Joining me is Kate Mulvany, Senior Consultant at Energy Market Analyst at Cornwall Insight, Morgan Wild, Head of Policy at Citizens Advice, and Katie Alpin, Head of Strategic Insight at Consumer Group Which. So I think the kind of the idea of this is there another kind of energy storm coming, and there's all been talk about government support packages and the fact the end to the energy support scheme, the £6-7 per month everyone was getting off their bills. The government in the budget extended the energy price guarantee, which means that it's capped at £2,500 for the average household until June. Kate, your company, Cornwall Insight, looks at where the price cap's going to go. What are your predictions for where it's going to go later this year and where it's going to sit out for the next sort of few years, I suppose, you look at as well?
So we've seen the benefits of falling global energy prices. Now, that might not be something people are feeling yet in their bills, particularly because of the buffer provided by the energy price guarantee and the price cap. But for the rest of this year, we are expecting to see a fall in prices. Now, the actual price for the price cap will be determined by the prices on a number of key markets, but we're expecting bills to be around £2,000 in Q3 and Q4 for the average household. Now, that's substantially above the £1,100, £1,200 people were probably paying before the big price spike, but it is also substantially lower than the £4,500 that costs reached.
Yeah.
Now, beyond that, we are expecting to see until the end of the decade elevated prices compared to average prices before the price spike. Now, that's due to a number of factors, not least the energy transition. So that's moving away from fossil fuels into renewable generation. That takes investment and time. And it's also to do with things like nuclear power plants coming to the end of their life and not having a direct replacement. So over the rest of the decade, we think there's going to be ongoing price volatility, and we think that the prices are going to stay higher than historical averages.
Yeah, so we'll come on to kind of what the government has been doing to prevent this kind of spikes that we saw again. Morgan, you know, as Kate says, it's a long way from the highs of sort of 4,000 up, but 2,000 is still a lot higher than where it has been. And without that energy support, you know, what do you think, you know, households are going to see? There's going to be quite a big change in their bills from this month onwards.
So we've just seen probably, one of the bleakest winters for people coming to Citizens Advice in years, if not decades, if not a generation. It's hard to overstate the level of sheer financial distress that the people coming to us are facing. We've had more people come to us in the first 3 months of the year for crisis support, so things like access to food banks, charitable grants, than we had in the entirety of 2019. That's with things like the energy bill support scheme of £400. That has provided some support, but we're really, really worried about what people are facing right now and what it looks like over the coming months.
Yeah, it does feel a bit Kate, like it was seen as a big sort of moment of national crisis in the autumn. That's why the government stepped in. It feels as though we're sort of a little bit sleepwalking into it at the moment. It doesn't feel as though the alarm bells are ringing when actually people's bills are going to open up their bills, all their direct debits, sort of being dubbed awful April, their direct debits for everything else like mobile phone, broadband, council tax, water, obviously the income tax threshold freezes as well. It does feel as though there's not really sounding the alarm bells in quite the same way from the government.
I think for me, you know, this is probably going to be the story of this year, is we're going to move from perhaps a story that's about a cost of living crisis into a prolonged living standards crisis. For all, we hope, it hasn't happened yet, but that the headline inflation indicators will at some point this year start to tick down. Effectively, that's a comparative measure, right? It's just a mathematical fact of year-on-year comparisons, which is what that measure is. It doesn't mean that prices are going down. And that's what is so hard for households to cope with. I mean, for me, the worrying indicator in the data we collect at Which, where we do some monthly tracking consumers every month, how they're getting on, is the missed payment rate, which has been above 8% in the first 3 months of this year. Now, that's really unusual. What we usually see is a spike at the start of the year. You know, it's been Christmas, everyone's had a lovely time, and they feel it in January. And then it usually goes down quite quickly. And we haven't seen that pattern at all this year. I've never seen that before, with that missed payment rate staying elevated above 8% of households telling us that they've missed, a mortgage, a rent, a bill payment in the first 3 months of the year. And that will feed directly into the number of people in difficulty that Morgan is seeing.
And that's exactly what we're seeing every day at the moment. Like, at its heart, this is a fairly simple formula that people have higher expenditure, their incomes aren't keeping pace. For people who come to us for debt advice, we are now advising over 50% of them who have more essential expenditure going out than they have income coming in. So that means exactly as Jay says, what happens in that situation is you can't pay your bills. You can't top up your energy meter if you're on a prepayment meter, so you're sitting in the dark. You can't afford to put food on the table, and you're worried about missing rent or mortgages.
Yeah. But Kate, obviously, in the budget, the energy price guarantee was extended until July. There's extra 3 months. And I guess the idea was that the gap between, obviously, there are two price caps. It's kind of confusing. The off-gem price cap, which is where the market is, and then the government stepped in, because obviously that shot up hugely. So the government stepped in and created sort of an artificial price cap underneath it. Because they're hoping that those two are going to meet each other. So how certain do you think that is? And how kind of volatile is the market going forward? And, is there still a chance for further shocks? And actually the government are going to have to work out how to deal with that in the future?
So it is very likely that the true price cap cost and the government support level is going to meet around about the middle of the year. It could be a little either way, but it is very likely to be very close. Now, that's obviously still a very high amount for bill payers in homes and in businesses. And the business support scheme has actually fallen away from March for the vast majority of organisations. So there is going to be a bit of a shock to the system as gradually some of that support comes away, but prices remain elevated compared to historical norms. Unfortunately, volatility is likely to remain. So there are two challenges. One is the pure cost, finding a way to afford your energy bill at home or businesses affording their bills. That's a real challenge. But then there's also the uncertainty. There's a stress that comes with not knowing what your bill's going to be 3 months from now, as well as just maintaining finances and understanding what to prioritise, how much you need to put aside to pay for next winter's energy. So that volatility has a real impact beyond the pure pence per kilowatt hour amount. Volatility is expected to remain. A lot of the drivers of the energy price strike are linked to things like the war in Ukraine. Internationally, we are, as a country, we're competing for gas through LNG, liquefied natural gas ships, with the whole world. So anything that happens internationally or geopolitically, or from a pipeline perspective, as we've seen as well, that has a ripple effect across all markets, and it will affect the price that people ultimately pay at home.
Well, two questions then on that. One, what has the government done since we saw these prices start to go up at the end, third quarter or fourth quarter of 2021? What have they done between now and then to alleviate some of those issues like the volatility of LNG stuff? And then also, what are they looking to do in the future? Again, have they got plans in place to make sort of energy more secure and prices more stable as a result?
So, as well as the immediate direct support that people will probably have mostly seen as line items on their energy bills, the government does recognise that there needs to be longer term strategic change. And I think one of the examples of that is something called the Review of Electricity Market Arrangements. It's incredibly exciting to energy geeks like me.
But I can see you, we're all riveted,
But I'm not assuming all of your listeners are as thrilled, but it is a fundamental and radical set of proposals intended to design a system that not only delivers decarbonisation, supports the country's net zero goals, but also does so in a way that ensures energy security, increased dependency on local generation, so wind farms in particular, using those as a way to secure long-term energy prices, to decarbonise the country, but also to provide more security around long-term delivery around energy prices than we've seen for quite some time.
In the short term, though, Which was saying that the poorest 10% of households are going to have to spend an average of £209 more on energy this financial year. So clearly there's stuff that's coming down. There's obviously big plans from the government, but in the short term, do you think that those issues that people are going to have to face and what the government is looking to maybe do you think there's a chance they might look at, again, further support grants in the future?
I think further support grants perhaps, but the challenge the government have really got is that they're in the same place they were, last winter when this crisis started. They haven't got a good mechanism for targeting this support, right? So they're stuck between something like the energy bill support scheme that they've previously used, where you're paying for every household to get that help. Now, that's very poorly targeted. It makes it very expensive. It means you're giving a lot of help to people who don't need it as much as the people who on the lowest incomes do. And that's exactly what's happening here, is that, you're taking that 400 quid away, and for some households, it's going to be all right. All right, they're going to pay a little bit more, but the lower prices are going to make it easier to bear.
Was a percentage of their bill,
that's it,
whereas a single person in one bedroom flat, £6-7 represent a huge amount. In fact, you're also in credit almost for your energy.
That's it. And it's that balancing act of what's the right way to target support. So what they're doing instead now is providing additional help through means tested and disability benefits. That is probably the best thing they could do in the emergency right now.
Yeah.
But it means that a lot of people who are living on the lowest incomes aren't going to get that support. So I'm quoting Morgan's work here, I'm really sorry, with the Social Market Foundation. But, what they've found is that 45% of people on the lowest 10% of incomes don't receive those means-tested or disability benefits that are making people eligible for that additional cost of living support now. So those people are getting no help at all. And as our research has shown, those people are going to be paying an average of £209 more on energy this year than last financial year. Now, if you're living on the breadline, £209 is an enormous amount, Really, to me, the way we start to address that is by looking at social tariffs. I mean, social tariffs would give us the ability to adjust both for household income and household energy consumption to better understand the kind of complexities around, for example, large households with members with disabilities who need more support, and be a way that we can properly make sure people are getting the help they need in the long term.
If you were going to run the past 18 months of this crisis again, you wouldn't...
Which we might do.
So it's good to learn from. You wouldn't take, I don't think, the approach that the government ended up taking. Last year, I think we responded to at least 5 fiscal events that provided...
Don't remind me.
that did provide much-needed support for people. But it was a real sense of just lurching from crisis to crisis, giving a little bit of support here, giving a little bit of support there, cost of living payments, increased benefits, all good stuff and all stuff that we were very pleased to see the government do, but there wasn't any overall strategy, and that meant 2 things. One is that we ended up, as Kate says, taking a much too untargeted approach because people didn't set out at day one and think, all right, what is the mechanism we need to build for delivery to provide support for people's energy bills who need it most. And that means that we also ended up not providing enough support for those who needed it most. There's a way forward here, though, and that is a social tariff that does those things. And I think it's really important that we don't assume that we're out of the woods and therefore don't need to take this kind of action. Prices are going to be high for much of the next decade, and we need a plan for that.
There is a knock-on impact as well around this policy uncertainty, and that's around investor confidence. So in order to build all of these wind farms, these new ways of generating electricity that are low carbon...
Going to be the Saudi Arabia of wind, according to the former Prime Minister.
There is a lot to be optimistic about there. But it does require investment from a range of parties. So the government doesn't have to borrow everything at day one. Now, some of those parties who've invested in the UK in the past have expressed concern that this policy uncertainty makes it less attractive to invest in the future. So that could mean that all of this infrastructure becomes more expensive. And although that's not got the immediate impact of the price crisis, it does have a long-term impact on what's affordable for individuals, but also for the country. So policy uncertainty, as well as causing individuals distress, as well as making things difficult for businesses in the short term, has a potential knock-on effect of making investment in the UK less attractive, particularly compared to Europe, compared to the US, where we're seeing the Inflation Reduction Act, absolutely accelerating investment in low carbon technologies. This policy uncertainty, it could end up making bills in that longer term view more expensive.
Yeah, it's interesting. And actually, talking about businesses in the UK, that the support for businesses, I wrote a lot last year about hospitality businesses and the struggles they were having with massively higher energy bills, and they felt that it took longer for their support to come in place and it wasn't as generous. That's ending now as well. Just talk us through a bit about what the support, if there is any, still there for businesses, and what the kind of differences. I saw there were 4 pubs in Bristol that all shut on the same day, which is the day that the energy bills stuff, businesses sign up in 12-month, 18-month contracts. They knew they weren't going to be able to sign a new contract they could afford. So what kind of support is there, really?
For most businesses, if we just look at the pure headline number, most businesses, the support has fallen away at the end of March. Now, those businesses were getting some support if they signed a new contract in a given window. So it wasn't every business that was getting support in the way that ultimately really every household near enough got support. Now, those businesses are facing directly rising energy costs. You mentioned hospitality. Their energy bills are very significant. Their next most impacted cost are people costs. Yeah. Everyone's wages, there is pressure for them to go up because everyone's bills at home are going up. So if you're in an industry that requires a lot of people, as hospitality does, those challenges are compounded. Now, we are seeing support in place for energy-intensive industries. These are things like steelworks, manufacturers, very, very, very large energy users. Now, the support they're receiving, it's not nothing, but given the amount of energy they use, there are real concerns that other governments providing support in their industry in other countries, they're going to still remain uncompetitive. So, for example, we talk to a lot of these large energy users, they're some of our customers, and they are telling us that even the support that's on offer, there's real uncertainty about their sustainability. And then it's part of that cycle. If businesses fold, people lose jobs, and it increases strain on the economy in other directions. So there are no simple answers here. The businesses that are still receiving support aren't out of the woods yet. Yeah. And a lot of businesses, as you've pointed out, they've recognised that in the near term, they're not viable because of those rising cost pressures, a lot of which have energy at their heart.
Yeah, it's like the sort of those cliff edges. There was one during COVID and there's one last year now, another one now as kind of go out. To go into individuals, so what can businesses do to help individuals, I suppose, in that sense? Because there's lots of things that are happening to individuals. That can they get better offers, get better deals, and try and help businesses help them with support and that sort of stuff to deal with. I keep coming back to awful April. I keep hating that phrase, but yeah, awful April essentially.
Yes, this is something we've been thinking about a lot at Which, because you're right, we're not saying this isn't a tough time for businesses as well. Of course it is, but we're talking about the well-being of people's customers, and we really are talking about well-being. The number of miserable people sitting in the cold, skipping meals, relying on food banks with all the stress and shame that comes with that, that Morgan and I are hearing about every day is hideous, frankly. And there is a lot that we think companies can do to help. So supermarkets are a really big one for me. Food inflation is such a big issue at the moment. Again, it's related to energy inflation. Yeah. These things are all linked, but running at a 45-year high. We've been looking at how the cost of some essential items have doubled in the last 12 months. And particularly we know that budget and online goods have been going up faster than the branded equivalents, which might surprise people. So for us, this really is about sort of making sure on supermarket shelves that the prices are really easy to compare. I mean, maybe it's just me. I spent nearly 5 minutes in a supermarket over the weekend comparing 2 different packets of mushrooms. One was on a special offer and one wasn't. And, there were 2 different sizes.
Right, yeah.
And I couldn't work out which was cheapest. It took me 5 minutes and I've got a degree in economics. And my poor husband is standing there next to me, wondering, when on earth am I going to get round to picking some mushrooms and moving on? But if you're at the stage where 20, 30p, which is what I saved, by the way, by doing the maths, is significant in your household budget, You're doing that. And come on, supermarkets, you can make that easier. That I don't think that is too much
big one at
to
the moment
ask.
is I'm boring my wife to tears about the size of cat food pouches, essentially, because they're normally like 100 grams, and in order to keep the price the same, they've shrunk the size of the pack. And I'm like, why are you performing shrinkflation on my cats? They can't do anything about it. So I'm trying to find a different one that has the equivalent size, but it's a classic example of what is happening, and to keep those prices. But they're just going up, and the cost of doing a weekly shop obviously is as high as it's been for decades and stuff. And is there anything that the government can maybe do around that as well, around food security? I suppose we'll talk about energy security, food security, and whether that's going to help with prices going forward.
Well, I think the thing here is that some forms of inflation are worse for the poorest people.
Yeah, the headline figure is sometimes a bit misleading, isn't it? Because it's the things
energy costs and food costs, costs of essentials that people can't avoid from paying, are increasing way more than the headline inflation figure suggests. So there are big things that the government can do to support people. So it's not a total answer, but investing in benefits like universal credit to a level that reflects the increase in costs that the poorest have faced would make a huge difference. It was very welcome to see the government increase universal credit and other benefits by the headline rate of inflation. That's 10%. That should come in April and will help to some extent. But that isn't the increase in costs that people are actually facing on the lowest incomes. It reflects a 10-year underinvestment in the benefits system. So 10% of increase or not enough to get by is not going to go as far as a 10% increase in an adequate benefit system to begin with.
One of the things that we talk about, sort of having that sort of stability for energy companies and the kind of for investment and stuff. There's also talk about windfall taxes and whether those energy companies have had huge profits, obviously with the prices going up, whether the creation of windfall taxes or the increasing those windfall taxes is going to damage investment and that sort of. How do Cornwall Insight kind of see that aspect of it, and whether you think that it's sort of a false equivalent sometimes with the way they look at it?
So the very high prices that people are paying at home is largely driven by the availability of energy. So globally, with the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, one of the most important gas routes into Europe ended. Now, at the time, the UK was only taking about 4% of gas from Russia, so it wasn't directly affected. But what we've seen is the amount of gas available in Europe for both heating and also for electricity generation, it's massively reduced. And so on a global stage, there are more people competing for less resources. So that increased price, and that flowed through to the UK. The bill that people receive at home from their supplier is a really small part of that chain. Now, the price that people see, absolutely, I can see why that infuriates people, and why it's very upsetting as well that they see their supplier's name next to this very high amount of money, and they assume the supplier's making a lot of money. I think the best guess for the last available year is that suppliers on average made minus 2.5% profit on their contracts. Now, if you take a step beyond the supplier and you go into the generation space.
Yeah, someone's making money somewhere, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That's where I think most of the headline figures have been found. And so windfall taxes have been largely applied to generators. Now, we touched on earlier the slightly knee-jerk reaction, I think, for some of the policy decisions. And you could say, looking at the windfall tax, that wasn't as well thought out and as nuanced as it might be to achieve maximum effectiveness. So the windfall tax, as it was applied, we'd encourage that to be looked at again if it was going to be adjusted, to make sure that it didn't disincentivise investment, particularly in low carbon generation, that in the long run is the best for bill payers. Having local, relatively speaking, generation that's secure, that's not dependent on geopolitics, that's also going to help with decarbonisation. Having that on our doorstep is in everyone's interests. Any windfall tax really does need to take that into account. Otherwise, it might feel satisfying in the short term, and it might provide a bit of a boost to the exchequer. Relatively modest in the grand scheme of things, but you can understand the appeal of it. But in the longer term, it does have to be thought about in the context of needing to attract investment in things like wind turbines to ensure that in the long run, bill payers are getting and taxpayers are getting the best possible deal.
Yeah. Is there anything that the consumers can do at the moment in terms of trying to deal with these kind of higher prices? Those long-term strategies, again, take a while to come in. What in the short term can consumers do at the moment?
I mean, I guess my steer would be, I think consumers are smart, right? They've been making adjustments for months and months now, and we risk being patronising if we tell people to shop around and look for budget, because they're already doing that, right?
Wear an extra jumper instead of putting the heating on, that sort of stuff.
We've all been doing those things. I think the really important thing I'd say is, if you are having difficulty paying your bills, you're not alone. There are millions of people around the country, sadly, in that situation at the minute. And help is available. So, if you're struggling with just one bill, the thing to do is call your provider. Even if you think you're not eligible for help, there are lots of different schemes they can offer. So do give them a ring or get in touch in another way that works for you and ask. Sadly, you do have to ask, but if you ask help should be there. And then if you've got multiple bills, then go talk to Morgan's brilliant colleagues at Citizens Advice or another free debt advice provider. There are brilliant organisations in this country that offer really caring support to people who are struggling.
It's a real combination of, there is loads that people will be able to do with proper support, so it's far from hopeless. So people coming to us can get help with the immediate crisis that they're in, so referrals to food banks, crisis support. They can then access our advice about things like how to make sure that they're maximising their incomes, if there's benefits that they haven't claimed, and ultimately if they're in problem debt, we can arrange plans with their creditors to come up with something that is reasonable to repay. There are limits to what advice can achieve, sadly. And
I was going to come on to that. So again, we talked about the sort of various things that the government brought in, various ad hoc schemes. There's sort of permanent structures that the government, do you think, might have to look at there? I guess the fact is they don't like things that don't have a time limit on them. Essentially, they like things that fall away. Politically, that does lead them into trouble when the calls for them to continue. But are there sort of permanent structures? You can talk about universal credit. Are there other things that they can put in place, you think, that for the rest of this year, maybe and beyond, to try and deal with some of the problems that we're seeing?
Yes, I think there are permanent structures, and I think they would end up being better value for money for the Exchequer, for taxpayers, than the approach that we've followed so far. So when the energy price guarantee was first announced, I think the estimate for how much it would cost over 6 months was something around 60 billion. The cost for our proposal for a social tariff is roughly 10% of that. So you can be really much more successful with a targeted, thought-out approach, and you can actually help the people who need help. So there's stuff to fix with social tariffs. There's definitely a need to invest in the benefits system. And for people who are falling into problem debt, there's a real urgency to fix some of basically the plumbing of how you support people. We see a lot of rogue companies who are trying to sell people a solution that won't work for them. So we think there's a real gap in regulation for people who are finding themselves in that awful situation.
Yeah, not that I want to end on a sad note, but what do you think is going to happen if those kind of permanent structures aren't put in place, if there isn't further stuff? What we're going to see, you talk about missed payments and stuff, as things get worse here. One thing we've not even talked about is mortgage rates and the amount of people that are coming off their tracker and on to have to remortgage this year and finding it's much higher than it would be. What do you think is going to happen if we don't see perhaps a return to further support this year?
I mean, further household difficulty.
Yeah.
We had 1 in 5 people this winter telling us that they were sitting uncomfortable because they didn't dare put the heating on. That has long-term health consequences apart from anything else. I mean, if people can't afford healthy food in the shops and they can't afford to light and heat their homes in those dark, cold winter months, we're seeing it already. We're seeing falling life expectancy. So, the case here, it's human need as much as anything else. And we have to think about that, I think, when we are doing the sums about what's worth investing.
Just to end on a note of hope, we can see in our data when policy works.
Right.
So when a cost of living payment comes in, we see a drop in demand of people coming to us for things like food bank referrals. In the pandemic, we saw an amazing reduction in a number of people coming to us for debt advice because the government had put in place the right set of rules and protections to make sure that people weren't facing financial ruin. So I guess my message is that policy can work and can have an effect, and we can fix this, but it requires real thought, energy, and a strategic approach to actually tackle some of these issues.
Yeah, definitely. And Kate, any sort of message of hope, I suppose, long-term policy solutions, I suppose, for kind of dealing with this stuff, and what do you think can be done maybe in both the short term and the long term, I guess, to not bring bills down because that's kind of more difficult, but in terms of providing that stability, I suppose, for people and certainty in terms of how they deal with household finances?
So some of the challenges we've been seeing for homes and businesses, they were always there for some people, and we have now got a greater and wider appreciation of the challenges that some people were, even before these price rises, were facing about being able to afford their bills. There is a significantly increased interest in energy, which affects virtually every industry. It definitely affects the potential for growth as a country. I'm really heartened by how sincere and open most stakeholders are to how do we make this better? How do we make this better now, but also in the longer term? And an awareness of the challenges around things like the energy transformation and decarbonisation. So that improvement in interest, that keenness to learn, to look at data, to read reports, to ask questions, that's not just coming from people directly interested in energy, that's coming from people with an interest in social welfare, social cohesion. To be honest, my own family, no one's ever wanted to talk to me about my job before. And I get, whenever we meet up, I get asked questions. So that just goes to show how far that willingness to learn and understand and do better, that's everywhere. So although it's very difficult at the moment and there are still clouds on the horizon, there's an awful lot to be optimistic about, that this is something we can improve and we can make better, and we can avoid these types of personal catastrophes from happening at this scale again.
That's all we've got time for this week, but you can read all the latest on the big stories from Westminster at PoliticsHome.com and keep right up to date by subscribing to our 7-day week newsletters by clicking on the link in the top right-hand corner of the website. Thanks to my guests, Kate Mulvany, Morgan Wild and Katie Alpin. Thanks to you all again for listening. Please subscribe wherever you podcasts and leave us a review. If you want to get in touch, then reach out to us on Twitter at PoliticsHome or email us via news@politicshome.com. But for now, I've been Alain Tolhurst, and this has been The Rundown.